Blood dripped from Eleanor Johnson's lip as the flight attendant Whitney towered over her. "First class isn't for everyone," she'd sneered. Eleanor just smiled, checking her watch. In exactly 3 minutes, her son Lawrence would board this plane. Skypeak Airlines belonged to him. Before we dive into this incredible story of dignity in the face of discrimination, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed unfair treatment on a flight, and subscribe to follow Eleanor's journey from humiliation to vindication. Now, let's rewind to see how this shocking moment came to be. Eleanor Johnson adjusted the small diamond brooch pinned to her modest navy dress as she entered Charleston International Airport. At 72, she moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms of restless children. The terminal bustled with holiday travelers, but Eleanor had arrived 3 hours early, a habit formed from a lifetime of careful planning. Today's journey was special. Her son Lawrence was turning 50, and his executive team had arranged a surprise celebration in Atlanta. What they didn't know was that Lawrence had another surprise coming his way. After decades of working in the aviation industry, he had quietly purchased Skypeak Airlines 4 months ago, becoming its CEO and majority shareholder. Eleanor's chest swelled with pride thinking about it, though she told no one about her son's success. Old habits, she murmured to herself, remembering the lean years in Greenwood, South Carolina, where she'd raised Lawrence alone after his father abandoned them when Lawrence was just 3 years old. The 1970s and 80s had been unforgiving for a single black mother in the South. Eleanor had worked 3 jobs simultaneously, teaching elementary school by day, bookkeeping for local businesses in the evenings, and sewing wedding dresses on weekends. Every extra penny went into a coffee tin labeled "Lawrence's Future," hidden in the back of her closet. "You're going to fly, baby," she'd whisper to her son as she tucked him in at night, often after he'd already fallen asleep waiting for her to come home from her second job. Higher than anyone expects. Lawrence had soared beyond even her ambitious dreams. His perfect SAT scores had earned him a partial scholarship to Stanford, with Eleanor's coffee tin providing the rest. When he was accepted to Stanford Business School, she'd sold their small house to help with tuition. Lawrence had begged her not to, but Eleanor was adamant. "Education is the one thing they can never take away from you," she told him. "I'll rent an apartment. It's temporary. Your future isn't." As Eleanor approached the check-in counter at Charleston International, she smiled at the memory of Lawrence's first job after business school, a junior analyst position at American Airlines. He'd risen quickly through management roles at various carriers before founding his own aviation consulting firm. His purchase of struggling Skypeak Airlines had been a masterful business move that few industry insiders knew about yet. "Good morning," Eleanor greeted the gate agent, a young man whose name tag identified him as Brent Harlow. "I have a reservation in first class." She presented her ID and confirmation number. Brent glanced at her worn leather purse and practical shoes before looking at his screen. His expression shifted subtly. "I'm showing you an economy, seat 27B, he said without looking up. "There must be a mistake," Eleanor replied calmly. "My son booked me in first class. The confirmation email shows seat 2A. She pulled out her phone to show him the email, but Brent barely glanced at it. "The system shows economy," he repeated with an edge of impatience. "There's nothing I can do about that." Eleanor noticed several other passengers watching the interaction. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed indifferent, and a few showed the slight satisfaction of people witnessing someone else's problems. "Could you please check again?" Eleanor asked, her teacher's voice firm but pleasant. Perhaps there was a system error. Brent sighed dramatically. "Look, economy is completely full. There are no other seats available." He didn't bother typing anything to verify this claim. "You're holding up the line." Eleanor stood her ground. "I understand you're busy, but I'd appreciate if you'd verify my reservation. The confirmation clearly shows first class." A woman behind Eleanor huffed loudly. "Some people just can't accept when they're wrong." Eleanor didn't turn around. She'd encountered this type of situation too many times in her 72 years to be baited into an undignified response. Brent finally tapped a few keys with obvious reluctance. His expression changed slightly. There does seem to be some discrepancy, he admitted, though his tone suggested this was Eleanor's fault somehow. The original booking was for first class, but it appears there was a change. I made no change, Eleanor said firmly. Well, someone did, Brent replied. But since you're insistent, I can restore the first-class seat. Just this once. He made it sound like an extraordinary favor rather than fixing an error. Eleanor accepted the boarding pass with the same dignity with which she'd handled the entire interaction. Thank you for resolving this. As she moved toward security, Eleanor noticed a tall, blonde flight attendant watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. Her name tag read, Whitney Morris, Senior Flight Attendant. Whitney whispered something to another crew member while glancing at Eleanor. Security was uneventful, and Eleanor found her gate with plenty of time to spare. She sat quietly, reviewing the photos of Lawrence's new house on her phone. He'd been begging her to move to Atlanta for years, to live in the guest house he'd designed with her in mind, but Eleanor valued her independence. Still, seeing the beautiful garden he'd planted knowing her love of camellias made her reconsider. The gate agent announced pre-boarding for first class, and Eleanor gathered her things. As she handed her boarding pass to the agent, she noticed Whitney Morris watching her again, this time with undisguised suspicion. Eleanor boarded the plane with quiet confidence. In less than an hour, her son would board this same aircraft for a surprise inspection of his newly acquired airline. Lawrence had texted her that morning, flying down to inspect the Charleston route today. Don't tell anyone I'm coming, want to see the real Sky Peak experience. Love you, Mom. Eleanor smiled to herself. She wasn't sure what would happen when Lawrence arrived, but she knew one thing for certain, she belonged in seat 2A, regardless of what anyone thought of her sensible shoes and weathered purse. The first-class cabin gleamed with polished wood accents and cream leather seats. Flight attendants bustled about, arranging welcome champagne and hot towels on silver trays. The air smelled of citrus and fresh coffee. Eleanor moved toward seat 2A by the window, her boarding pass clutched firmly in hand. She had barely settled her small carry-on under the seat when Whitney Morris appeared beside her, towering in her crisp uniform and impeccable makeup. Excuse me, Whitney said, her voice carrying to nearby passengers. I believe you might be in the wrong section. Eleanor looked up calmly. No, this is my seat. 2A. She offered her boarding pass for inspection. Whitney took the pass, examining it with exaggerated scrutiny. How interesting. This does say 2A. Her tone suggested she found this deeply suspicious. May I ask how you came to be in first class today? My son booked the ticket for me, Eleanor replied simply. I see. Whitney's smile didn't reach her eyes. And does your son fly with us often? More than you might realize, Eleanor said, maintaining her composure. Whitney's lips tightened. Well, there appears to be some confusion. Our system was showing this seat as unoccupied earlier. The gate agent corrected a system error, Eleanor explained patiently. Everything is in order now. Whitney's perfectly manicured finger tapped against the boarding pass. We've had issues with boarding pass mix-ups recently. She turned and beckoned to a male flight attendant arranging welcome drinks. Jason, could you verify this passenger's reservation? Jason Riley, whose kind eyes contrasted with Whitney's cold assessment, took Eleanor's boarding pass and checked the tablet he carried. There was a system error that was corrected at the gate, he confirmed after a moment. Ms. Johnson is confirmed for 2A. Whitney's mouth tightened further. That's highly irregular. Did someone get bumped from first class to accommodate this change? No, Jason replied, looking increasingly uncomfortable. The seat was showing as unoccupied. It appears the original booking was correct, but something changed in the system. Well, Whitney said, company policy states that last-minute seat changes need supervisor approval. I'm the senior flight attendant on this flight, and I don't recall approving this. The gate agent handled it, Eleanor said calmly. If you'd like to speak with them, I'm sure they can confirm. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper. Is there a problem? He asked. I couldn't help overhearing. No problem, Mr. Phillips, Whitney answered quickly. Just a seating confusion we're sorting out. Thomas Phillips, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, looked at Eleanor sympathetically. The lady has a boarding pass for that seat, correct? Then what's the confusion? Whitney's professional smile strained at the edges. It's a procedural issue, sir. Nothing to concern yourself with. It seems straightforward to me, Phillips persisted. The passenger has a confirmed first-class ticket. I've been flying Skypeak for 15 years, and I've never seen such questioning over a valid boarding pass. Whitney's cheeks flushed slightly. Sir, with all due respect, airline procedures can be complex. Not this one, Phillips responded. The lady has a boarding pass. Let her enjoy her flight. Other first-class passengers were now watching openly. Whitney clearly felt her authority being challenged. Ms. Johnson, Whitney said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, perhaps you'd be more comfortable in economy. First class has certain expectations of its passengers. Eleanor met Whitney's gaze steadily. I'm quite comfortable here, thank you. This is my assigned seat. Whitney's smile disappeared entirely. Very well. But I'll need to confirm this with the captain. As Whitney turned away sharply, her elbow bumped Eleanor's arm, causing the water glass Jason had just placed on her tray table to spill across Eleanor's lap. Oh! Eleanor exclaimed softly, reaching for a napkin. Whitney spun back. Please be careful with your beverages, she snapped, loud enough for everyone to hear. These seats are premium leather. You bumped her arm, Jason pointed out quietly. I did no such thing, Whitney replied icily. And now she's creating a disturbance. Eleanor dabbed at her damp dress. It's just water, she said calmly. No harm done. This is exactly the sort of situation I was concerned about, Whitney continued as if Eleanor hadn't spoken. Some passengers aren't accustomed to first-class service. Thomas Phillips put down his newspaper entirely now. That's completely uncalled for, he said firmly. A young couple across the aisle had begun filming discreetly with their phones. The woman, Alicia Richardson, whispered to her husband Jordan, "Is this really happening?" Whitney noticed the phones and seemed to grow more agitated. "No unauthorized recording on this aircraft," she said sharply. "Actually," Jordan replied, "Skypeak's policy only prohibits recording of safety demonstrations and crew safety procedures. Passengers are permitted to record their own experience." Whitney's composure visibly cracked. She reached for Eleanor's arm. "I think you need to gather your belongings." Eleanor tried to pull away, but Whitney's grip tightened, pulling Eleanor forward. In the struggle, Eleanor's face struck the metal armrest, cutting her lip. A collective gasp went through the cabin as a small trickle of blood appeared. "You're hurting her," Alicia exclaimed, still recording. "She's resisting crew instructions," Whitney shot back, though she had released Eleanor's arm. "That's a federal offense." Eleanor touched her lip gently, a small spot of blood staining her fingertip. She remained remarkably composed, reaching into her purse for a tissue. "I'm not resisting anything," she said quietly. "I'm simply sitting in my assigned seat." Whitney straightened her uniform. "I'm calling the captain. This has gone far enough." She picked up the cabin phone, her back rigid with anger. Eleanor glanced at her watch and smiled slightly despite her bleeding lip. Lawrence's flight from Atlanta would have landed. He would be boarding in approximately 3 minutes. Security will remove you if necessary, Whitney threatened, misinterpreting Eleanor's smile as defiance. Eleanor just nodded. 3 minutes, she said softly. What was that? Whitney demanded. Nothing important, Eleanor replied, dabbing her lip. Just counting the minutes. The first-class cabin had transformed from a space of luxury and calm into a theater of tension and divided loyalties. Every passenger was now fully engaged in the unfolding drama between Eleanor Johnson and flight attendant Whitney Morris. Thomas Phillips, the businessman who had first spoken up, now stood from his seat. This has gone far enough, he declared, his authoritative voice carrying through the cabin. This woman has done nothing wrong except sit in her assigned seat. Sir, please return to your seat, Whitney ordered. This is a safety issue now. The only safety issue I see is your treatment of this passenger, Thomas replied firmly. Across the aisle, the young couple Alicia and Jordan Richardson continued recording. Alicia's hands trembled slightly as she captured Whitney's aggressive stance and Eleanor's bloodied lip. I can't believe this is happening in 2025, Jordan whispered to his wife. This is going straight to social media once we land. Have you ever witnessed discrimination but felt unsure about speaking up? Comment number 1 if you believe bystanders have a responsibility to intervene, or number 2 if you think it's better to document quietly like the Richardsons. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of courage in the face of prejudice. A few rows back, an older white man in an expensive suit sighed dramatically. Can we please just take off? Some of us have important meetings to get to. Gerald Montgomery, CEO of a regional banking chain, checked his Rolex impatiently. Sir, we're handling a situation with a disruptive passenger, Whitney explained, seemingly grateful for an ally. The only disruption I see is coming from you, Thomas Phillips shot back before turning to Gerald. Would you be so quick to dismiss this if it was your mother bleeding? Gerald shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. In seat 3B, Vanessa Washington, a black executive for a Fortune 500 company, watched the scene with growing distress. She recognized the subtle and not-so-subtle forms of discrimination playing out before her but remained frozen in her seat. Years of navigating corporate America as a black woman had taught her the high cost of being labeled difficult or angry. Should I say something, she wondered, her stomach knotting with the familiar conflict between self-preservation and solidarity. Across from Vanessa, college student Tyler Zhang stood up. Excuse me, he said, his voice cracking slightly with nervousness. I saw what happened. The flight attendant bumped her arm and caused the spill, then grabbed her. I have it on video. Whitney's face flushed deep red. Delete that immediately. Recording crew members is against regulations. That's not accurate, Tyler replied, gaining confidence. I checked Skypeak's policy before my flight. Passengers may record their own experiences as long as they don't interfere with safety procedures. David Wilson, an attorney seated in 1C, raised his hand. I'd like your employee number, please, he said calmly to Whitney. And the name of your supervisor. Whitney ignored him, turning back to Eleanor. This is your final warning. Move to your original seat in economy, or I'll have security remove you from this flight. Jason, the other flight attendant, had been standing back, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Now he stepped forward. Whitney, maybe we should stay out of this, Jason, Whitney snapped. I'm the senior flight attendant. I make the decisions here. More passengers from economy class had begun to notice the commotion, craning their necks to see what was happening in first class. Whispers traveled down the aisle, they're trying to throw an old lady off the plane. She's bleeding. Someone's filming it. Whitney grabbed the cabin phone again. Captain Spencer, we have a situation in first class. Passenger refusing crew instructions. We need security. Eleanor remained composed, occasionally dabbing her lip, but otherwise sitting perfectly still. She checked her watch again. Captain Richard Spencer's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're calling airport security to assist with a situation on board. Please remain seated." A ripple of concern moved through the cabin. More phones came out to record. "Is this really necessary?" Jason asked Whitney quietly. "She's just sitting there." "She's defying my direct instructions," Whitney hissed back. "We can't let passengers think they can do that." Eleanor caught Jason's eye and gave him a small, reassuring smile, as if she were comforting him rather than the other way around. Security Officer Marcus Dunn boarded the plane, his uniform crisp and his expression professional. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, addressing no one in particular. Whitney immediately stepped forward. "This passenger refused to sit in her assigned economy seat, caused a disturbance by spilling a drink, and is now refusing to comply with crew instructions." Marcus turned to Eleanor, who sat calmly with a tissue pressed to her lip. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened?" "I have a confirmed first-class ticket," Eleanor explained quietly. "The flight attendant questioned my right to be here, bumped my arm causing a spill, then grabbed me when I tried to clean it up. My lip was cut when she pulled me forward." Marcus looked from Eleanor to Whitney, clearly sensing something wasn't adding up. "May I see your boarding pass, ma'am?" Eleanor handed it over. Marcus examined it, then looked at Whitney. "This does show she's assigned to this seat." "There was a system error," Whitney insisted. "She was originally booked in economy." "That was corrected at the gate," Jason interjected. "The system now shows Ms. Johnson confirmed in 2A. Other passengers began to speak up simultaneously. "She did nothing wrong. The attendant has been targeting her from the start. I recorded the whole thing. Check the security cameras." Have you ever been in a situation where speaking truth to power felt risky? Comment number 3 if you've ever stood up against injustice like these passengers, or number 4 if you've regretted staying silent. Hit like if you believe in the power of collective action against discrimination. Marcus raised his hands for quiet. "Let's all calm down. Ma'am," he addressed Eleanor, "is there anything else you'd like to add?" Eleanor glanced at her watch one final time. "Just that I'm waiting for someone to board this plane. He should be here any moment now." Whitney gave a derisive laugh. "Let me guess, you know someone important. A friend in airline management, perhaps?" Eleanor met Whitney's gaze steadily. "Not a friend," she replied with quiet dignity. "I raised him." As if on cue, a commotion started at the front of the plane. The boarding door reopened, and all heads turned to see who was entering. Lawrence Johnson strode through the airport terminal with the confident gait of a man accustomed to command. At 50, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored charcoal suit, his closely cropped salt and pepper hair framing a face that financial magazines had featured on numerous covers. Few people recognized him at Charleston International. His acquisition of Sky Peak Airlines was still known only to top executives and the board of directors. He'd flown in from Atlanta on a private jet specifically to conduct a surprise quality inspection on the Charleston-Atlanta route. Sky Peak had been losing market share for years before his purchase, with customer complaints about discriminatory treatment making up an alarming percentage of the negative feedback. "Mr. Johnson." A ground staff member approached him. "Is everything all right, sir? You seem to be in a hurry." "I'm fine, thank you," Lawrence replied, checking his watch. "Just need to catch the Atlanta flight. Flight 1387. They're still boarding, but there seems to be some kind of situation on board." Security was just called. Lawrence stopped abruptly. "What kind of situation?" "I'm not sure, sir. Something about a disruptive passenger in first class." A cold feeling washed over Lawrence. His mother was on that flight, in first class. He quickened his pace, nearly running to the gate. "Sir, you can't go down there without a boarding pass," the gate agent called after him. Lawrence pulled out his CEO credentials. I need to board that plane immediately." The gate agent's eyes widened as she recognized the name. "Mr. Johnson. We didn't know you were coming today." "That was the point," he said grimly, heading down the jetway. Back on the plane, Eleanor Johnson sat with quiet dignity as Security Officer Marcus Dunn tried to make sense of the situation. The first-class cabin had become increasingly divided, with most passengers now openly supporting Eleanor against Whitney's accusations. "Ma'am," Marcus said to Whitney, "if the passenger has a valid boarding pass for this seat, I'm not sure what you want me to do here." "She's being disruptive," Whitney insisted, though Eleanor had barely moved or spoken. "By bleeding on your plane?" Thomas Phillips interjected sarcastically. Whitney shot him a venomous look before turning back to Marcus. "This is an internal airline matter. You wouldn't understand the protocols." "I understand that this passenger appears to have been physically injured," Marcus replied firmly. "That's not a protocol issue, that's potentially a legal one." A movement at the front of the plane caught everyone's attention. The boarding door reopened, and a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit entered. The effect on the crew was immediate and dramatic. Flight attendant Jason's eyes widened in recognition. "Oh my God," he whispered. Whitney didn't immediately register who had boarded. She was focused on Marcus, still trying to convince him to remove Eleanor. Lawrence Johnson scanned the cabin, his expression darkening as he spotted his mother with a bloodied tissue pressed to her lip. He moved forward with purposeful strides, crew members flattening themselves against the galley walls as he passed. "Mom." Lawrence's deep voice carried through the suddenly silent cabin. "What happened to your lip?" Eleanor's face softened with relief. "Lawrence. You're right on time." Whitney turned, confusion crossing her face as she looked between Eleanor and the imposing newcomer. "Excuse me, sir, you can't just board this aircraft. We're dealing with a situation here." Lawrence didn't even glance at Whitney. He knelt beside his mother's seat, gently taking the tissue from her and examining the cut. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet but carried an undercurrent of controlled fury. Before Eleanor could answer, Jason stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, sir," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "There was an unfortunate incident. Whitney didn't realize, that is, we didn't know." Whitney's confusion deepened. "Mr. Johnson?" Then recognition dawned as she remembered the memo that had circulated weeks ago announcing new ownership. Her face drained of color. You're Lawrence Johnson," he confirmed, finally turning to face her. "CEO and majority owner of Skypeak Airlines. And this," he gestured to Eleanor, "is my mother, Eleanor Johnson." The cabin fell into stunned silence. Whitney's mouth opened and closed several times, no words emerging. "Sir," Jason said quickly, "there was a misunderstanding about Mrs. Johnson's seat assignment." Whitney was attempting to resolve the situation when things escalated. Lawrence's gaze never left Whitney. "Escalated to the point where my 72-year-old mother is bleeding? Escalated to the point of calling security?" His voice remained measured, but ice-cold. Whitney finally found her voice. "Mr. Johnson, I had no idea she was your mother." "She didn't say, would it have mattered?" Lawrence interrupted. "Should any passenger be treated differently based on who they know? Or how they look? Or what they're wearing?" "Of course not," Whitney stammered. "But there were procedures." "The procedure," Lawrence cut in, "is to treat every passenger with dignity and respect. The procedure is to assume that if a passenger has a boarding pass for first class, they belong in first class." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. "Lawrence, please. Everyone is watching." Indeed, the entire cabin sat in rapt attention, many still recording on their phones. The story of the airline's CEO discovering his mother bleeding after being mistreated by his own staff was unfolding like a dramatic movie scene. Lawrence took a deep breath, visibly collecting himself. He turned to Security Officer Marcus. "Officer, thank you for your assistance. I'll handle this from here." Marcus nodded, clearly relieved. "Yes, sir. Do you need medical attention for your mother?" "I'll see to that," Lawrence replied. He turned to Jason. "Please bring a first aid kit immediately." As Jason hurried to comply, Lawrence addressed the cabin at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this delay and for what you've witnessed today. This is not what Sky Peak Airline stands for under my leadership." He turned back to Whitney, who stood rigid with shock and fear. "Ms. Morris, I'd like you to collect your belongings and exit the aircraft. Your employment with Sky Peak is suspended pending review." "Mr. Johnson," Whitney pleaded, "if I'd known who she was." "That's precisely the problem," Lawrence interrupted. "You treated her differently because you thought she was nobody important. That ends today at Sky Peak." He gestured toward the exit. "Security will escort you to HR for processing." Marcus stepped forward. "Ma'am. This way, please." Whitney looked around desperately, seeking support from her fellow crew members, but found none. With stiff movements, she collected her purse from the crew area and followed Marcus off the plane, her career imploding with each step. As she disappeared down the jetway, Lawrence turned back to his mother, taking the seat beside her as Jason returned with the first aid kit. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he said quietly. "This should never have happened." Eleanor shook her head slightly. "Don't apologize for something you didn't do." She glanced around at the still-watching passengers. "Though I think I've caused quite a scene on your airline." Lawrence smiled for the first time since boarding. "No, Mom. You just helped me identify exactly what needs to change." He addressed the cabin again. "Folks, we'll be on our way shortly. Thank you for your patience." As Jason carefully tended to Eleanor's cut lip, Lawrence held his mother's hand, the CEO and the former schoolteacher presenting a powerful image of dignity reclaimed. The passengers, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary, finally lowered their phones, giving mother and son a moment of privacy in the midst of what would soon become a viral sensation. The first-class cabin buzzed with hushed conversations as Jason gently applied antibiotic ointment to Eleanor's cut lip. Lawrence Johnson remained beside his mother, his tall frame folded into the adjacent seat, one hand protectively covering hers. "It's just a small cut," Eleanor assured him. "Hardly worth all this fuss." "Any injury to you is worth my attention," Lawrence replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of love and respect. The plane remained at the gate, the departure delayed as Lawrence took control of the situation with the quiet authority that had made him a business legend. He looked up as Captain Richard Spencer emerged from the cockpit, making his way down the aisle. "Mr. Johnson," the captain said, extending his hand. "We weren't expecting you today." "I'm Captain Spencer." "Apparently not," Lawrence replied, his tone neutral but his meaning clear as he shook the captain's hand. "Do you have a moment to discuss what happened here?" "Of course, sir." Spencer glanced uncomfortably at Eleanor. "Perhaps in the galley?" Lawrence turned to his mother. "Will you be all right for a minute?" Eleanor nodded. "Go. Do what you need to do." As Lawrence and Captain Spencer stepped into the galley for a private conversation, the remaining passengers watched with fascinated attention. This was corporate drama playing out in real time, with real consequences. "I've never seen anything like this," Alicia Richardson whispered to her husband, Jordan. The CEO's mother. "What are the odds?" "No odds," Thomas Phillips commented from across the aisle. "Just karma catching up to that flight attendant. I've seen her type before, drunk on the smallest amount of power." In the galley, Lawrence spoke in low, measured tones to Captain Spencer, who listened with growing alarm. "I need to understand how this happened," Lawrence said. "Not just today, but the culture that made it possible." "Sir, I assure you, this isn't typical of our service," Spencer began. "Isn't it?" Lawrence countered. Skypeak has the highest rate of discrimination complaints in the industry. That's one of the reasons I acquired the airline, to fix that problem. Spencer paled slightly. I wasn't aware of those statistics. Clearly, Lawrence replied. Tell me about Whitney Morris. How long has she worked here? 15 years, sir. She's always been strict about procedures. Strict? Or selective in how she applies them? Spencer hesitated, which told Lawrence everything he needed to know. I see, Lawrence said. One more question, if my mother had been a young white woman in designer clothes, would Whitney have questioned her right to sit in first class? The captain had no answer. Meanwhile, Whitney Morris was being escorted through the terminal by security officer Marcus Dunn, her face a mask of shock and humiliation. This is a mistake, she kept saying. Once Mr. Johnson understands the full situation, he'll see I was just following protocol. Marcus said nothing, having seen enough to form his own opinion. Back on the plane, Lawrence returned to the first-class cabin, where Jason had finished treating Eleanor's lip. Captain Spencer will be making an announcement shortly, Lawrence informed the passengers. In the meantime, I'd like to personally apologize to everyone for the delay. No apology necessary, Thomas Phillips said firmly. It's about time someone addressed this kind of behavior. Several passengers murmured in agreement. Lawrence looked around the cabin, taking in the faces watching him, some supportive, others uncomfortable, a few unreadable. I'd like to be clear about something, he said. What happened today is unacceptable on any airline, but especially on mine. The behavior you witnessed does not reflect the values of Skypeak under my leadership. Will the flight attendant be fired? Someone asked from the back. Personnel matters are confidential, Lawrence replied diplomatically. But I can assure you that appropriate action will be taken. Eleanor touched her son's arm. Lawrence, she said quietly, I don't want to be the reason someone loses their livelihood. Several passengers looked surprised at her compassion. Even after how she treated you? Alicia asked incredulously. Eleanor turned to the young woman with a gentle smile. Especially after that. Punishment without education doesn't solve the underlying problem. Lawrence studied his mother's face, conflicting emotions evident in his expression, respect for her wisdom warring with his protective instinct and responsibility as CEO. We'll discuss it, he promised, though his tone suggested his mind was largely made up. The intercom crackled to life with Captain Spencer's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're completing some final preparations and should be ready for departure in approximately 15 minutes. Thank you for your patience. Lawrence made a decision. I'll be staying on board for this flight, he announced, looking at his mother. I was planning a surprise inspection anyway. Eleanor smiled. You always were good at multitasking. A flight attendant appeared with a fresh first-class meal for Eleanor and a hastily arranged place setting for Lawrence. The remaining crew moved with nervous efficiency, acutely aware that the CEO was watching their every move. Lawrence stood and addressed the cabin crew gathered in the galley. I want to be clear about something, he said, his voice low but carrying to every crew member. Skypeak Airlines serves every passenger with equal respect. Period. Anyone who cannot commit to that principle has no place on this team. The crew members nodded, some looking ashamed, others relieved. Now, Lawrence continued, let's give these passengers the excellent experience they paid for. As Lawrence returned to his seat, he found his mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Mom. Are you in pain? He asked with concern. Eleanor shook her head. Just proud, she whispered. So very proud. The plane finally pushed back from the gate, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule. Lawrence pulled out his phone, using the aircraft's Wi-Fi to send a series of urgent messages to his executive team. We need an emergency meeting as soon as we land, he typed to his COO. What happened today suggests a systemic problem, not an isolated incident. Already on it, came the swift reply. Videos are hitting social media. Whitney Morris has filed multiple complaints against black passengers over the years. HR buried them. Lawrence's jaw tightened. Find out who authorized the cover-ups. I want names by the time we land. He switched to another message thread with his PR director. Prepare a statement addressing today's incident. No corporate speak. Acknowledge the problem honestly and outline immediate actions. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Lawrence gazed out the window, watching the clouds below. His mind was already formulating the sweeping changes Skypeak would need to implement. Beside him, Eleanor rested with her eyes closed, her composure never having wavered despite the ordeal. He thought of all the times she must have faced similar treatment over the years without him there to intervene, without her connection to him to shield her. The realization both saddened and strengthened his resolve. Things are going to change, Mom, he whispered, though she couldn't hear him over the engine noise. I promise you that. The gentle hum of the engines provided a backdrop as Lawrence Johnson studied his sleeping mother. Eleanor's face, even in repose, carried the dignified expression that had been her armor throughout her life. The small bandage on her lip was the only visible evidence of what she'd endured. As the flight progressed toward Atlanta, Lawrence's mind drifted back to his childhood in Greenwood, South Carolina. He remembered being 8 years old, holding his mother's hand as they entered Wilkinson's department store to buy him new school shoes. May I help you? The saleswoman had asked, her gaze sliding past Eleanor to land on a white couple who had entered after them. We've been waiting, Eleanor had said firmly but politely. Well, I'm sure you don't mind, the saleswoman had replied with a tight smile. These folks look like they're in a hurry. Lawrence remembered the way his mother's back had straightened, how she'd squeezed his hand just a little tighter. Actually, we're in a hurry too, Eleanor had said. And we were here first. We'll wait for the next available salesperson. The woman had looked annoyed but moved on. Later, in the car, Lawrence had asked, why didn't you get mad at her, Mom? Eleanor had considered her answer carefully. Because, Lawrence, getting angry would have given her power over me. My dignity isn't something anyone else can take away, only something I can give away. Have you ever witnessed someone maintain their dignity in the face of discrimination? Comment number 5 if you've seen strength like Eleanor's, or number 6 if you wish you had her composure. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about remarkable individuals who changed systems through their quiet power. The memory faded as Lawrence felt his phone vibrate. His executive team had been busy during the flight. He scrolled through the incoming messages with growing concern. Whitney Morris has had 17 complaints filed against her in 5 years, his HR director had written. 13 were from passengers of color. All were dismissed by former VP of Customer Experience, Gerald Whitman. Lawrence frowned. Whitman had been one of the few executives he'd kept after acquiring Skypeak, based on the man's apparent expertise and institutional knowledge. Another message contained links to social media posts. The video of Whitney confronting Eleanor had already accumulated over 2 million views across platforms, with hashtags #FlyingWhileBlack and #SkypeakShame trending nationally. A third message was even more concerning, found multiple similar incidents across the airline. Pattern suggests institutional problem, not isolated cases. Eleanor stirred beside him, her eyes blinking open. You look troubled, she observed, always attuned to her son's moods even after all these years. I am, Lawrence admitted. This goes deeper than one flight attendant, Mom. The company culture allowed this behavior to flourish. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Systems usually protect themselves, she said. That's why changing them is so difficult. Tell me something, Lawrence asked, keeping his voice low. Was this the first time you've experienced this kind of treatment on a flight? Eleanor's slight hesitation told him everything. No, she admitted. But usually it's more subtle. A look here, a comment there. Nothing worth making a fuss about. It's all worth making a fuss about, Mom. She smiled at him gently. That's why you're going to make things better. You always could see problems others ignored. Their conversation was interrupted as flight attendant Jason approached cautiously. Excuse me, Mr. Johnson. Several passengers would like to speak with you if you have a moment. Lawrence glanced at his mother, who nodded encouragingly. Of course, he said. One by one, passengers came forward to share their observations of what had happened with Whitney. Thomas Phillips described witnessing similar behavior from Whitney on previous flights. Alicia and Jordan Richardson offered to share their video recording. Vanessa Washington, the black executive who had initially remained silent, approached last. Mr. Johnson, she said quietly, what happened to your mother happens every day, in ways big and small. Most of us just endure it because fighting back often makes things worse. Not anymore, Lawrence replied. Not on my airline, at least. As passengers returned to their seats, Lawrence turned back to his mother. I let you down, he said softly. Eleanor looked surprised. How do you figure that? I should have protected you from this. She shook her head firmly. Lawrence, I've been handling situations like this since before you were born. Besides, you can't be everywhere. But I own the airline, Mom. This happened on my watch. Yes, she agreed, and now you have the opportunity to fix it. Not just for me, but for everyone who doesn't have a son who owns the company. Lawrence nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I've been approaching this all wrong, he realized. When I bought Sky Peak, I focused on restructuring debt, optimizing routes, upgrading the fleet. All the business school solutions. Those matter too, Eleanor said. But they're meaningless if we're not treating people with basic dignity. He pulled out his tablet and began making notes with rapid efficiency. We need comprehensive anti-bias training for all staff. A complete overhaul of complaint procedures. New hiring practices. And accountability, real consequences for discriminatory behavior. Eleanor watched him with pride. You always did throw yourself completely into solving problems. I learned from the best, Lawrence replied, smiling at his mother. His phone buzzed again with another message, Gerald Whitman attempting damage control. Claiming Whitney Morris acted alone against company policy. Evidence suggests otherwise. Lawrence's expression hardened. He knew, he said quietly. The VP of Customer Experience knew this was happening and did nothing. People protect what benefits them, Eleanor observed. Even if that means ignoring harm to others. Lawrence nodded grimly. His resignation will be the first of many. As the plane began its descent into Atlanta, Lawrence made one final call to his assistant. Reschedule tomorrow's meetings, he instructed. And book the main conference room for the entire day. We're launching a complete cultural overhaul. Eleanor listened with quiet approval. What about your birthday celebration? She asked. Lawrence waved dismissively. That can wait. No, Eleanor said firmly, surprising him. It shouldn't wait. Mom, after what happened today, because of what happened today, she interrupted, you should proceed exactly as planned. Lawrence looked confused. Why? Eleanor smiled, the wisdom of her 72 years evident in her expression. Because moments of crisis are when leadership is most visible. Your team has planned this celebration for weeks. Canceling it sends one message. Transforming it sends another. Lawrence studied his mother's face, understanding dawning. You want me to use the occasion to announce the changes. Timing matters, she said simply. You taught me that, actually. When you were 7 and waited until after I'd had my favorite dessert to tell me you'd broken the living room lamp. Lawrence laughed, the tension of the day briefly breaking. I'd forgotten about that. I hadn't, Eleanor replied with a smile. Smart even then. As the plane touched down in Atlanta, Lawrence had made his decision. His birthday celebration would proceed, but with a purpose none of his executives could have anticipated. And his mother, as always, would be right there beside him, her quiet wisdom guiding him still. What would you do if you suddenly had the power to change an unjust system? Comment number 7 if you'd make immediate, sweeping changes like Lawrence plans to, or number 8 if you take a more gradual approach. Hit subscribe if you believe in the power of using privilege to create positive change. The wheels of Flight 1387 touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 2:17 p.m., 17 minutes behind schedule. What awaited Lawrence and Eleanor Johnson as they taxied to the gate was unprecedented in Skypeak's 30-year history. "Mr. Johnson," Jason said, approaching their seats as the plane rolled toward the terminal. "I've just been informed there are news crews waiting at the gate." Lawrence raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Jason nodded uncomfortably. "Apparently the videos have gone viral. Social media is calling it the Skypeak incident." Eleanor sighed. "Oh dear. I never meant to cause such a commotion." "You didn't cause anything, Mom," Lawrence replied firmly. "Whitney Morris and a broken system did." As the plane approached the gate, Lawrence could see through the windows that Jason hadn't exaggerated. At least 4 camera crews were positioned near the jet bridge entrance, along with a cluster of people holding microphones. Lawrence turned to his mother. "Are you up for this? We can arrange to exit through another gate." Eleanor straightened her simple navy dress and touched her silver hair. "I'm fine, Lawrence. I've faced much worse than a few cameras." Lawrence smiled at her resilience. "Let me handle the talking." "I raised a smart son," she replied with a wink. As the plane parked at the gate and the seatbelt sign turned off, Lawrence stood and addressed the first-class cabin one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for your patience today. It seems our arrival has attracted some attention. Please know that Skypeak takes full responsibility for what occurred, and meaningful changes are already underway." Thomas Phillips stood and offered his hand. "Thank you for stepping up, Mr. Johnson. It's rare to see a CEO personally handle a situation like this." Lawrence shook his hand firmly. "It shouldn't be rare, but thank you." As passengers began to deplane, Lawrence and Eleanor remained seated, allowing others to exit first. Lawrence's phone rang, his PR director, Sophia Chen. "Lawrence, are you aware of the media presence?" she asked without preamble. "Just found out." "How bad is it?" "The video of your mother being confronted has over 5 million views and climbing. The one where you board and identify yourself has nearly 3 million. Hashtag SkypeakShame is trending nationally, but so is hashtag COSun. People are calling you a hero for how you handled it." Lawrence frowned. "I'm not the hero here. My mother is." "Then tell that story," Sophia advised. "I've drafted a statement, but honestly, the press wants to hear directly from you both. How's Mrs. Johnson doing?" Lawrence glanced at his mother, who was calmly gathering her belongings. "She's incredible, as always. We'll make a brief statement, then head to the office." "Good. Oh, and Lawrence. The competition is already circling. United just announced a Respect for All campaign. Delta's CEO released a statement about their commitment to dignity." "Let them," Lawrence replied. "We're going to do more than talk." As the last passengers deplaned, Lawrence and Eleanor finally rose from their seats. Lawrence offered his arm, which Eleanor took with a smile. "Just like prom night," she joked. "Except I'm the one who needs an escort this time." Lawrence chuckled. "You escorted me through the first 25 years of my life, Mom. I'm just returning the favor." They walked together to the aircraft door. The moment they appeared in the jetway, camera flashes erupted, and reporters began shouting questions. "Mr. Johnson. What's your response to the discriminatory treatment of your mother? Mrs. Johnson. How do you feel about what happened? Will Whitney Morris be terminated? Was this a staged publicity stunt? Lawrence raised a hand for quiet, his commanding presence immediately drawing attention. My mother and I will make a brief statement, but she's had a difficult day, so we'll not be taking questions at this time. The reporters fell silent, cameras rolling. Lawrence looked at the statement Sophia had sent to his phone, then put the device away without reading it. Today, my mother, Eleanor Johnson, experienced something that happens to far too many travelers who don't look like what some people think a first-class passenger should look like. She was questioned, humiliated, and physically injured by a Skypeak employee who made assumptions based solely on appearance. He paused, his hand tightening on Eleanor's arm. What happened today was unacceptable. As CEO of Skypeak Airlines, I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed this incident to occur. Effective immediately, we are launching a comprehensive review of our training, complaint procedures, and accountability systems. Eleanor stepped forward slightly. May I? She asked her son quietly. Lawrence nodded, stepping back to let his mother speak. I want to thank everyone for their concern, Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. What happened today was unfortunate, but not unique. Many people face similar treatment every day without cameras recording it or powerful relatives to intervene. If any good comes from this incident, I hope it's that we all examine our assumptions about who belongs where. The reporters remained uncharacteristically silent, captivated by Eleanor's dignity. Now, she concluded with a small smile, my son has a birthday to celebrate and an airline to run. Thank you for your time. The statement complete, Lawrence guided his mother through the terminal where his executive team waited, looking tense and apologetic. Conference room is ready, said Michael Torres, Skypeak COO. The whole executive team is standing by. Good, Lawrence replied. Because we have a lot to discuss. While Lawrence convened with his executives in a glass-walled conference room, Eleanor settled into a comfortable chair in his office, watching news coverage of the Skypeak incident on a wall-mounted television. The hashtags #FlySkypeak and #Eleanor Johnson had joined #SkypeakShame in trending nationwide. Video clips played on repeat across news channels, each with their own spin. CEO's mother experiences racism on his own airline, the flight attendant who picked the wrong passenger to mistreat, moment of reckoning for airline industry. Eleanor shook her head at the spectacle, turning down the volume. She picked up a framed photograph on Lawrence's desk, herself at his Stanford graduation, both of them beaming with pride, her arm around his waist, his around her shoulders. She'd worn her best dress that day, purchased specially for the occasion, and saved for months to afford the flight to California. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reminiscence. Lawrence's assistant, Amara, entered with a tray. Mrs. Johnson. I thought you might like some tea and something to eat. That's very thoughtful, thank you. Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully. Amara hesitated. Mrs. Johnson, I just wanted to say. My grandmother experienced something similar last year on another airline. No one did anything about it. Seeing Mr. Johnson take action means a lot to many of us. Eleanor smiled warmly. Sometimes it takes a shock to catalyze change. Though I wouldn't recommend getting a split lip as the method. Amara laughed. Is there anything else you need? Actually, Eleanor said, I'd like to see the complaints that were filed against that flight attendant. Whitney Morris. Can you arrange that? Amara looked surprised but nodded. I'll see what I can do. In the conference room, Lawrence stood before his executive team, his expression grave. 17 complaints against one flight attendant, 13 from passengers of color, all dismissed. Explain that to me, Gerald. Gerald Whitman, VP of Customer Experience, shifted uncomfortably. The complaints were investigated according to standard protocol. Don't, Lawrence interrupted sharply. Don't hide behind protocols. Whitney Morris had a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior that you ignored. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, Gerald began, Whitney has been with Skypeak for 15 years. She's one of our most experienced. Experience doesn't excuse bigotry, Lawrence cut in. Your job was to ensure every passenger had an equal experience. You failed. Gerald's face reddened. If you're suggesting I condone discriminatory behavior, I'm not suggesting it. The evidence confirms it. Lawrence laid a folder on the table. Your resignation letter is in here. Sign it, and we'll provide 6-month severance. Fight it, and we'll make the documentation public. A tense silence fell over the room. Gerald slowly reached for the folder. This isn't just about Gerald or Whitney, Lawrence continued, addressing the entire team. This is about a systemic failure at every level. We allowed a culture where discrimination could thrive unchecked. That ends today. For the next 2 hours, Lawrence outlined his vision for transforming Sky Peak, from mandatory anti-bias training for all employees to a complete overhaul of the complaint system, including an independent review board. His executives took frantic notes, occasionally exchanging alarmed glances at the scope and speed of the proposed changes. Sir, the CFO ventured, these initiatives will be expensive. The shareholders will understand that discrimination is bad for business, Lawrence replied firmly. Our stock is already down 8% today. Doing nothing would cost us more in the long run. As the meeting concluded, Lawrence made one final announcement. My birthday celebration tomorrow evening will proceed as planned, but with a different purpose. We'll use the occasion to announce our new direction to all employees and the media. I expect everyone here to be fully on board. Back in Lawrence's office, Eleanor had compiled her own notes after reviewing the complaints against Whitney Morris. When Lawrence returned, looking exhausted but determined, she handed him her observations. You should see this, she said. There's a pattern that goes beyond Whitney. Certain airports, certain routes have significantly more complaints. Lawrence scanned her notes with growing concern. How did you spot this so quickly? Eleanor smiled. 40 years of grading papers trains you to recognize patterns. The Charleston route has 3 times the discrimination complaints of any other route. That suggests a cultural problem at that specific location. Lawrence shook his head in amazement. I've had analysts reviewing this data for weeks and they missed that. Sometimes you need fresh eyes, Eleanor replied. And perhaps eyes that have experienced the problem firsthand. Lawrence studied his mother thoughtfully. Would you consider chairing our new diversity advisory board? We need someone who understands these issues from lived experience, not just data points. Eleanor looked surprised. Me? Lawrence, I'm just a retired teacher. You're much more than that, he replied. You're exactly what this company needs right now. Wisdom, dignity, and first-hand understanding of the problem we're trying to solve. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'll consider it. But first, we need to get you ready for your birthday party. I have a feeling it's going to be quite different from what your team planned. Lawrence smiled, some of the day's tension finally leaving his face. That seems to be a theme lately. Nothing is turning out quite as expected. That's how transformation works, Eleanor said wisely. It rarely arrives in the package you anticipated. 1 week after the Sky Peak incident, as it was now universally known in the media, the grand ballroom of the Atlanta Ritz-Carlton had been transformed. What was originally planned as Lawrence Johnson's 50th birthday celebration had become something far more significant, the public launch of Sky Peak's comprehensive anti-discrimination initiative. The room buzzed with energy as hundreds of employees, industry leaders, and media representatives gathered. A stage had been set up at the front, with a podium bearing the new Sky Peak logo, the traditional mountain peak now embraced by a circle, symbolizing inclusion. Eleanor Johnson sat in the front row, elegant in a sapphire blue dress that Lawrence had insisted on buying for her. The small cut on her lip had healed, leaving no visible mark, though the incident that caused it had left an indelible impression on the airline industry. Mrs. Johnson. A young flight attendant approached shyly. I just wanted to thank you. Because of what happened to you, things are already changing for us. Eleanor smiled warmly. What's your name, dear? Zoe Williams. I just completed training last month. Well, Zoe, remember that change doesn't happen from one incident. It happens when people like you carry it forward every day in how you treat others. Zoe nodded earnestly. Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what they emphasized in our new training module. As Zoe returned to her seat, Michael Torres, Skypeak COO, approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. What began as a birthday celebration has evolved into something much more important, a moment of transformation for Skypeak Airlines. It's my honor to introduce the catalyst for this change, our CEO and my friend, Lawrence Johnson. Applause filled the room as Lawrence took the stage, looking sharp in a tailored suit but with an expression of seriousness that belied the celebratory setting. Thank you, Michael, Lawrence began. 50 years ago today, I was born to an extraordinary woman who taught me that the measure of success isn't what you achieve for yourself, but what you do for others. 1 week ago, that woman, my mother, Eleanor Johnson, experienced something on one of our planes that no passenger should ever experience. Lawrence gestured toward Eleanor, and the audience applauded as cameras turned to capture her dignified smile. What happened to my mother was not an isolated incident, Lawrence continued. It was the result of a system that allowed discriminatory behavior to go unchecked. As CEO, I take full responsibility for that system. And as CEO, I am committed to transforming it. He clicked a remote, and behind him appeared a slide with the words, "Dignity Always Initiative," prominently displayed. Today, I'm announcing the most comprehensive anti-discrimination program in the airline industry. It begins with 3 immediate actions. Lawrence outlined the changes. Whitney Morris had been terminated, along with 2 executives who had systematically buried discrimination complaints. A new mandatory training program was being implemented for all 12,000 Skypeak employees. And most significantly, an independent diversity advisory board would oversee all aspects of customer experience, with direct reporting to the CEO. This board will be chaired by someone who understands firsthand the importance of dignity in customer service, Lawrence announced. Someone whose wisdom and compassion have guided me throughout my life. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to announce that Eleanor Johnson has agreed to lead this crucial initiative. The audience erupted in applause as Eleanor looked up in surprise. She had agreed to consider the role but hadn't given her final answer. Yet seeing the hopeful faces around her, she realized her son had known her decision before she had fully made it herself. Lawrence continued, detailing additional changes. A new reporting system for passengers to flag discriminatory treatment, a partnership with civil rights organizations to audit Skypeak's practices, and the creation of the Eleanor Johnson Scholarship for underprivileged students pursuing careers in aviation. These changes won't happen overnight, Lawrence acknowledged. Cultural transformation takes time. But make no mistake, Skypeak is committed to creating an environment where every passenger and employee is treated with equal dignity and respect. As Lawrence spoke, Eleanor's mind drifted to a memory from 25 years earlier. Lawrence had been in his first year at Stanford, coming home for Christmas break. They'd gone to the local diner, where the hostess had seated them by the kitchen despite numerous empty tables in better locations. "Mom," Lawrence had whispered, "they're putting us here because we're black." Eleanor had nodded calmly. "Yes, they are. Shouldn't we say something?" "We are saying something," she'd replied. "By sitting here with our back straight and our dignity intact, we're saying we deserve to be here as much as anyone else." Sometimes the loudest statement is simply refusing to be diminished. Now, watching her son transform an entire company culture because of what he'd learned from her, Eleanor felt a profound sense of vindication. The lessons she'd taught him about dignity hadn't just shaped his character, they were reshaping an industry. Lawrence was concluding his speech. "The incident involving my mother was painful, but it has become a catalyst for necessary change. As we implement these initiatives, I ask each of you, from our board members to our newest hires, to embrace this transformation with courage and commitment. He paused, looking directly at Eleanor. And now, I'd like to invite the true guest of honor to say a few words. Mom. The audience rose in a standing ovation as Eleanor made her way to the podium. Lawrence embraced her before stepping aside, pride evident in his expression. Eleanor adjusted the microphone and surveyed the room filled with expectant faces. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm not accustomed to speaking to large groups anymore. The last time was addressing my 5th grade class before retirement, and they were considerably shorter than all of you. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. What happened to me last week was unfortunate, but not unique, Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. Every day, people face small and large indignities based on how they look, what they wear, or who they are. Most don't have a son who owns the company. Most don't have viral videos to amplify their experience. She paused, making eye contact with various employees throughout the room. The true test of character, for individuals and for companies, is how we treat those we believe can't benefit us. How we treat those we think don't matter. Eleanor gestured toward her son. Lawrence learned that lesson early. When he was 7 years old, I took him to volunteer at a nursing home. An elderly man with dementia kept calling Lawrence by the wrong name. Instead of correcting him, Lawrence answered to whatever name the man used. Afterward, I asked him why. He said, it didn't hurt me to answer to a different name, but it might have hurt him to know he was wrong. She smiled at the memory. That's the compassion that Sky Peak needs, that all of us need. The understanding that small courtesies matter, that dignity is everyone's right, not a privilege for some. Eleanor concluded her remarks to thunderous applause, the room on its feet once more as Lawrence rejoined her at the podium, mother and son standing together in a powerful image of legacy and transformation. As the formal presentation ended and the celebration transitioned to a reception, industry leaders approached Lawrence with congratulations and, in many cases, nervous questions about their own practices. The Sky Peak incident had sent ripples through the entire aviation sector, with other airlines scrambling to examine their own complaint records and training procedures. Behind the stage, in a quiet moment away from the crowds, Lawrence and Eleanor stood together, looking at a photograph from his childhood that had been enlarged for the event, Eleanor in her teacher's dress, holding the hand of 7-year-old Lawrence as they entered his elementary school. I remember that day, Lawrence said softly. 1st grade. I was terrified. You didn't show it, Eleanor replied. You walked in with your head high. Because you taught me to. Eleanor touched the photograph gently. Look how far we've come. Lawrence put his arm around his mother's shoulders. With so much further still to go. Eleanor nodded, her expression thoughtful. Lawrence, I've been thinking about the Diversity Advisory Board. I want to do it, but not alone. We should include some of the passengers who spoke up on that flight, like Thomas Phillips and Vanessa Washington. And that young couple who recorded everything. We need multiple perspectives. Lawrence smiled. Already in progress, Mom. They've all agreed to join, with you as chairperson. You knew I'd accept. I knew you'd never walk away from a chance to create meaningful change, Lawrence replied. It's not in your nature. As they returned to the reception, Eleanor was approached by reporters and industry leaders, all eager to hear more about the woman whose dignity had launched a corporate revolution. Through it all, she maintained the same calm presence that had defined her through decades of teaching and raising her son, modest but unwavering, gentle but unbending. By the end of the evening, #DignityAlways had replaced #SkyPeakShame as the trending hashtag associated with the airline. The transformation had begun, not just in policies and procedures, but in the public perception of what Sky Peak Airlines stood for. As Lawrence and Eleanor left the event, employees lined up spontaneously to applaud them. One by one, flight attendants, baggage handlers, pilots, and office staff stood in respect as mother and son walked past, a guard of honor for the woman whose refusal to be diminished had elevated them all. 6 months later, Eleanor Johnson settled into Seat 2A on Skypeak Flight 1387 from Charleston to Atlanta. The familiar route had taken on special significance since that fateful day, becoming something of a symbol within the company. Today's journey was particularly meaningful. Eleanor was traveling to receive an honorary doctorate from Stanford University, Lawrence's alma mater, in recognition of her work with the Skypeak Dignity Always initiative. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," greeted Zoe Williams, now a senior flight attendant despite her relatively recent hire. "It's wonderful to see you again." "Hello, Zoe," Eleanor replied warmly. "How are those night classes coming along?" "Very well, thank you. The Eleanor Johnson Scholarship is making it possible for me to finish my degree in organizational psychology." Eleanor smiled. "That knowledge will serve the airline well." The first-class cabin had undergone subtle but significant changes in the past 6 months. The crew was noticeably more diverse. The safety cards now featured illustrations of passengers from various backgrounds. Even the in-flight magazine showcased a cover story about accessible travel for passengers with disabilities. But the most profound change was invisible, the atmosphere of respectful attention that permeated every interaction. The flight attendants treated each passenger with the same careful consideration, regardless of appearance or attire. As the plane prepared for departure, Eleanor reflected on the extraordinary changes that had unfolded since that January day when Whitney Morris had challenged her right to sit in first class. The transformation of Skypeak had been swift and comprehensive. Lawrence had been true to his word, implementing every aspect of the Dignity Always initiative with characteristic thoroughness. Whitney's attempt to sue for wrongful termination had failed spectacularly when the pattern of complaints against her became public. The executives who had enabled her behavior had quietly left the industry altogether. More importantly, Skypeak had become a model for the aviation industry. Their passenger satisfaction scores had risen by 47%. Employee retention had improved dramatically. And perhaps most tellingly, Skypeak had seen a 32% increase in diverse passengers booking first and business class seats, people who had previously avoided premium cabins due to concerns about discriminatory treatment. Eleanor opened her tablet to review her speech for the Stanford ceremony. The words, "dignity as a catalyst for change," topped the document. She had never imagined becoming a public speaker at 73, but life had taken unexpected turns. The Diversity Advisory Board she chaired had expanded its scope beyond Skypeak, consulting with other airlines and transportation companies. Eleanor's simple philosophy, that dignity was everyone's right, not a privilege, had resonated in an industry struggling with issues of equity and inclusion. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Eleanor gazed out the window at the clouds below, remembering how she'd scrimped and saved for decades, putting Lawrence's education before her own comfort. She'd never imagined flying first class back then. Her goal had been simply to give her son opportunities she never had. "Mrs. Johnson." A voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Thomas Phillips, the businessman who had first spoken up in her defense, standing in the aisle. "Mr. Phillips. What a lovely surprise." He smiled warmly. "I'm heading to a meeting at Skypeak headquarters. I don't know if Lawrence mentioned it, but I've joined the company's new passenger advocacy department." "He did mention it," Eleanor replied. "He said you were perfect for the role." Phillips nodded. "After what happened, well, I realized I wanted to be part of the solution. I'd seen similar situations before and stayed quiet too often." "Speaking up that day made all the difference," Eleanor assured him. As Thomas continued to his seat, Eleanor returned to her thoughts. The ripple effects of that January confrontation continued to spread in ways she could never have anticipated. Lawrence had told her just yesterday that 3 other major airlines had adopted versions of Skypeak's anti-bias training program. The airline industry as a whole was being forced to reckon with long-standing issues of discrimination that had been brushed aside for decades. Eleanor's split lip had become the face of a movement larger than herself. When the plane landed in Atlanta, Eleanor was surprised to see Lawrence waiting at the gate, a bouquet of yellow roses, her favorite, in his hands. "I thought you were meeting me at Stanford tomorrow," she said as he embraced her. "And miss escorting my mother to receive an honorary doctorate?" "Not a chance." Lawrence offered her his arm. "Besides, I have news that couldn't wait." As they walked through the terminal, Eleanor noticed people recognizing them, smiling and nodding respectfully. Lawrence's news couldn't wait until they reached the car. "The board approved the expansion," he said excitedly. "Skypeak will be launching 10 new international routes next year, all operating under the Dignity Always protocols. We're taking this global, Mom." Eleanor squeezed his arm. "I'm so proud of you, Lawrence. Not because of your success, but because of how you've used it." "I learned from the best," he replied. "A teacher who believed dignity wasn't negotiable." As they passed through the terminal, Skypeak employees stopped what they were doing and stood in respect, not because of any protocol or requirement, but out of genuine admiration for the woman whose quiet strength had transformed their company. Eleanor Johnson walked with her head high, just as she had taught her son to do all those years ago. The cut on her lip had long since healed without a scar, but its impact remained indelible, a small injury that had launched a movement, a moment of indignity that had ultimately elevated thousands. In first class on that January day, Whitney Morris had sneered, "First class isn't for everyone." She had been wrong. Dignity was for everyone, and Eleanor Johnson had proven it with nothing more than her unflinching composure and the strength of her character. As mother and son exited the airport into the bright Atlanta sunshine, Eleanor thought of all the battles she had fought quietly throughout her life, the small indignities endured, the subtle prejudices navigated, the calm persistence required simply to exist with self-respect in a world that often denied it to people who looked like her. "You know," she said to Lawrence as they approached his car, "I never wanted to change the world. I just wanted to live in it with dignity." Lawrence smiled at his mother, the airline CEO and the former schoolteacher, united in purpose as they had always been. "Sometimes, Mom, that's exactly how the world changes. One person at a time, insisting on their right to dignity." Eleanor Johnson's story teaches us that true dignity cannot be taken away, only surrendered. Throughout her life, she maintained her composure in the face of discrimination, not because she accepted mistreatment, but because she understood a profound truth: her worth wasn't determined by others' perceptions. This powerful tale shows how systemic change often begins with a single act of courage. Eleanor didn't seek confrontation, but neither did she shrink from it. Her quiet strength ultimately transformed an entire industry. For those with privilege and power like Lawrence, the lesson is equally important. It's not enough to succeed personally. True leadership means using your position to create systems where everyone is treated with respect. Lawrence didn't just defend his mother, he addressed the root causes that made such discrimination possible. The Skypeak transformation reminds us that meaningful change requires both personal dignity and institutional accountability. Neither alone is sufficient. What moments in your life have tested your dignity? Have you ever witnessed discrimination and wondered what you should do? Share your experiences in the comments below. If Eleanor's story of quiet strength resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories of courage against injustice. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation. May we all remember that dignity isn't a privilege for some, but a right for everyone.